Anne KRUEGER is a professor of international economics at Johns Hopkins University in Washington since 2007. Before taking on that position, she held a number of very senior positions in global economic policy making, including the position of first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund from 2001 to 2006. In the 1990s, she was a professor of economics at Stanford University. In the 1980s, she was chief economist of the World Bank. And in the 1970s, she wrote a number of very famous papers. The most famous paper I recall was one in which she coined the term rent-seeking, which is a term, I'm not sure whether she invented it or whether she popularized it, but it's certainly a term that is of extreme relevance to our discussion this evening. My name is Wolfgang Muncher. I'm an associate editor of the Financial Times, and I will be asking Anne a number of questions about the financial crisis. We will go on for just under an hour, and then we will open up the debate, open up the forum to you. And before we try to predict the future, let us start off predicting the past. Let us talk about what caused this financial crisis. Do we really understand at this point why this crisis came about? Is this really, as we were led to believe, a crisis of some dysfunctional financial markets, a dysfunctional banking regulation system, bad capital adequacy, ratios which can be easily fixed? Or is this a much more fundamental crisis that might have something to do not just with the financial sector, but also with our global economic system, our global monetary system?
Those are important questions, and ones to which I don't think any of us can really claim that we will, or that we know the answer now. We're learning, we're thinking about it, we've got some pieces of it. I think it's going to be several years at least of good academic research and some retrospective before we're really on top of it. So anything I say tonight is tentative and based on what I think now, and I reserve the right to change my mind within the course of a discussion. Anyway, no, I do not think it was simply financial. I think that the deep underlying cause, if you want to call it that, was the so-called global imbalances, which led to both the Chinese very large current account surplus, and then the rest of the world had a choice. It could indeed have tried to keep its books in order, in which case the world would earlier have had a recession, or it could have done what in fact happened, but the US did most of it, which was a current account deficit to offset the Chinese surplus. Now that in turn did lead to very low world real interest rates. And very low world real interest rates lead financial people to do some things, and they lead real people to do some things. Real people are more likely to borrow for houses when interest rates are low. Businesses, in fact, are more likely to take capital-intensive investment. But the financial sector is going to go on a search for yield. They're going to go into more risky efforts simply to try and regain some of what they otherwise would have had real interest rates been higher. Now, that said, there were a lot of things that happened that made things worse than they would otherwise be. For example, it's quite clear, I think, that there were a lot of financial institutions that did misjudge the situation. Congress in the United States in 1998 passed an Equal Housing Opportunity Act that mandated that a fraction of all mortgages should be to low-income people, and the banks obeyed in part because otherwise they couldn't have lent at all. A lot of these things contributed and obviously at the margin made things worse, but once the housing price increases were going up, people did begin speculating in housing, there's no doubt. Mortgages were free in the sense that you didn't have to put anything down to get a house, and many people were buying on pure speculation. All of that contributed to the whole thing, and quite clearly the banks did not keep track of what risk was on their books. Many of the CEOs, I am told, thought that they had much more of the risk off their books than they in fact had. So a number of factors contributed, both on the real and the financial side. The fact that there was an increasing supply of unskilled labor-intensive goods in East Asia basically meant that the policymakers in the industrial countries did not perceive the inflation they would have perceived in earlier run-ups. So that took away one of the signals that would have been there. and other things went on too. So obviously it was a perfect storm in some sense. But to get way ahead of ourselves right now, in the longer term, I do not see anything coming out of this crisis that's going to solve the long-term problem of what happens when there are the global imbalances. And yet it seems to me that's a fundamental issue.
Now, if you are right, it is the global imbalances, and obviously, as you said, we will not know for some time precisely what caused this crisis. We didn't know what caused the 1930s depression until decades after it occurred. We are seeing at the moment some form of rebalancing. The U.S. current account deficit is going down, especially the U.S. Personal sector is adjusting very, very rapidly. Current account deficits in China and Germany are falling very rapidly. Now, is this what we're seeing now in the world? Is this just sort of some temporary shock, or is this actual rebalancing going on?
I think, well, let's see what happens next. I mean, we know that a current account deficit is the difference between saving and investment. And we know that in the United States, what's going to happen in the short term is the fiscal deficit, which is public dissaving, is going to go up greatly, as I think it probably should. But I suspect that what has happened so far, which was a healthy running down to some extent slowly of the imbalances, will probably be reversed over the next year or two. That much said, though, quite clearly, whatever else anybody thought, we were at what you would call full employment, certainly from 2004 and 2007. And I think every elementary macroeconomics book talks about having a counter-cyclical fiscal policy, whereby in the good years you at least balance your budget and maybe run a surplus, so that in the bad years you can, in fact, run a deficit. The United States was running a deficit in the good years. So were many other countries, and so it's hard not to blame governments to some extent also for the situation we're in.
So can I now ask you the really difficult question?
I thought you already did.
So how do you see this panning out now? I mean, we hear talk of green shoots, which many of us are skeptical of, but beyond the immediate, immediate quarter, what are your scenarios for the next 5 years of this crisis?
Well, I think there are separate parts to that. The first thing is the first question is, when will we hit bottom? When will the turning point come? The next question is quite clearly, what will be the nature of the upturn? And then finally, what will be the longer term? And I think they're interrelated, and depending on what you think will happen in one, you may have a different view of what will happen in the other. There's a lot of evidence for green shoots in the United States right now, and also in a few other countries. East Asia, Korea has announced much better figures just, I think, in the past couple of days. And some of the trade credit that dried up that made some of the exporting countries go down so dramatically, so quickly, seems to be coming back. And that's going to affect a couple of other countries positively, too. But I think the U.S. probably will lead the upturn. And if it turns out that, as things now look, sometime this summer, early fall, the U.S. hits bottom, that could augur well for then giving some help to other parts of the world where things aren't so good. That does assume, of course, that we get that turnaround. And one of the things that I judge to be absolutely critical for getting out of the bottom is whether the housing prices bottom out. As long as housing prices are falling in the United States, there will be incentives for more people to send their keys in the mail. It's called jingle mail. They just send the keys to the bank, and that's the end of that. U.S. bankruptcy law is different from anybody else's in that personal bankruptcy is quite separate from what you do with your house. And as long as people are finding that the face value of what they owe is greater than what they can get for their mortgages, there is an incentive that's much greater in the U.S. than other places, which is intensified in this case because many of the foreclosures are on either second homes or homes that were bought for pure speculation and never lived in. So that I think that we will see the bottom of the housing market, not uniformly throughout the country and not all at once, but enough so people regain confidence in the near 6-8 month range, and that when that is clearly in sight, then we will see the beginning of the upturn, I think.
But we're already seeing, the Schiller case, on the Schiller case index, we've seen a fall since the peak. Sure. Of 30%. Mm-hmm. We see a massive overhang of unsold houses that on past relationships would suggest that a period of price decline would continue for at least a year. If you look at the trend line, that would the trend line of house prices, you would assume some 40 to 50% a fall in peak to trough house prices. We see extreme stress in the commercial real estate situation. So is this not, from the latest data as well, are we not really being on the housing side a little too optimistic that we can see? I mean, what is it that would actually get the housing market up? Is it interest rates? Is it policy?
All sorts of things. First, there is some policy move in that direction. How strong it is subject to debate. There is for years, the estimate has been that we need about 1.5 million new housing units a year to replace, excuse me, ones that indeed are just falling apart, plus new family formation. Last year's and this year's rate of new starts is 400,000. So we're working off that inventory at a fairly rapid pace. Prices have fallen. There are already reports in a number of communities where indeed buying is picking up. I have a small place in Florida, and all the tourist agencies are now busy advertising. And they bring people on tours. They meet them on a bus, and they don't even take them where they're going to stay first. They take them on a tour for the first day where they're going to show them 15 houses that have been units that are foreclosed and up for sale. And the next day they go for 30 more. The next day they go for 30 more. And approximately 1 in 3 persons on those tours is buying. People are looking and they're shopping for the low prices. That does seem to be starting to kick in. So I think you have to differentiate the housing starts, which will be a little slower, from the housing price bottom, and that goes to the used housing market and what happens with that overhang. And as I said, we don't know, but a judgment could be made that that's coming later this year.
Let's stay with your scenario. Let's say there is a mild upturn in the housing market later this year. A recovery led by the United States. What is your outlook beyond this? Is this going to be, are we going to go back to growth rates ex ante, or are we, is the long term, are we going to stay below potential growth, or whatever do we define to be?
Well, now what I said is we'd hit the bottom of the housing prices and the housing market, and they'd stabilize. Right. There's still in the discussion in the U.S. a lot of questions about what the shape of the recovery will be. Where one kind of argument is that we saw a fairly sharp downturn, so we'll see a fairly sharp upturn, so it's a V. The other argument is that no, for whatever set of reasons, it's going to be a much slower recovery, and because it's going to be slower, it's going to be much more the U-shaped recovery, and you might even call it the L-shaped recovery, yes, if you really want to get pessimistic, where you bounce along the bottom.
I've heard about sinus shapes, where you get sort of waves of declining amplitudes.
One of your FT correspondents had another one yesterday too. Anyway, there is a question about that, and I don't think the answer is in what's happening. I think quite clearly the aggregate demand stimulus is going to be strong and is going to be kicking in later this year and early next. The stimulus bill itself, plus the other things the administration is doing, are pouring enormous monies into that. And if indeed the bottom of the housing market comes, then banks will be willing to lend again, and then you get the flow of credit, and you got those two things, demand would be picking up on that score. But we also have the balance sheet effects. And obviously, a lot of people are going to spend a lot of time wanting to restore their balance sheets, meaning that they will spend less than they otherwise would on consumption or investment or whatever for a while, and that would augur a slower downturn. Now, my read is that aggregate demand will outrace balance sheet effects over the next, let's say, year. Partly because people who cut back their expenditures cut back very sharply, much in fear of what would happen, and some of that will be reversed even as others are restoring the damage and so on. So I tend to be, if it's optimistic in the short run, that the upturn will be fairly sharp in the U.S. I think we can talk about the rest of the world because that's more uneven. But certainly, well, not certainly, but certainly I think that next year, aggregate demand stimuli will be enough that would offset that balance sheets. Longer term, I'm not so optimistic.
And how longer term on the balance sheet side in the United States, before we turn to the rest of the world, how long will it take for American households to repair the balance sheet?
Goodness knows. Well, some of them can't. I mean, some of them are retired already, and they're taking the hit. And that's one argument why looking at the total loss does not tell you what can happen, because there are people who just have to pretty much take it, and that's it. There's a second factor involved, too, in addition to how long will it take, and that is how far they'll go. And that's hard to say, too. The quote, normal, the saving rate for consumers out of disposable income was about 6%. At its worst, there were home equity loans and everything flying, it was down to -4. It's now back up to about +3, and the guesstimate is that this coming quarter will be again up to 4. And how much higher will it go? That's one of the unknowns. The bigger worry, I think, over the next year or so is inflation. The Federal Reserve has poured liquidity into the system like mad, as to some extent was certainly appropriate, but nobody knew how much. Then we have the stimulus package. 13% fiscal deficit is a size not really seen in an industrial country before, and projecting that 2 years running is at least a little bit scary. All of those things, I think, are very likely to lead to inflationary pressures, and the big question over the intermediate term is, can they withdraw that liquidity from the banking system, and can they get the fiscal difficulties under control? The U.S. public debt to GDP, or public debt as a percent of GDP at the beginning of 2008 was 41%. On current projections, it'll be up over 70 by the end of the fiscal year 2010. And the debt servicing on federal deficit will have gone from 8 to 16% of GDP in that shorter time. And if you believe that President Obama would stick to his present budget projections, despite all that, the U.S. goes to 100% by the end of the teen decade.
When we hear from more and more economists that only inflation can save us now, my question to you is, what is your assessment of how the present team at the Federal Reserve, in particular, would face a situation in which you get price pressures? I mean, obviously there are policy choices to be made. The Fed has a dual target, so there could be, there could be legitimate debate about letting inflation go or causing another leg of a recession. Yeah. How would you think they will react?
Well, first off, I have not looked at the Fed minutes, but I'm told by those who have that in every meeting there's a long discussion of how they'll start withdrawing liquidity and how they'll exit and all that. And there are strong statements of intention that they will do it. And as of right now, I'm quite sure you could bring every Fed governor into court. They would swear and mean it, that they were going to bring that liquidity back in under control as soon as they could. Now, in fact, when they should do it probably is not when we get back to full employment, because there's always a lag between when monetary policy is put in place and when it acts. They should probably begin withdrawing liquidity, especially if the upturn is strong, much earlier than that. But that's going to bring howls from the politicians. And the politicians will indeed be putting extreme pressure on the Fed not to start withdrawing liquidity for a lot longer period of time than should be, which is what makes me quite pessimistic about the likelihood of getting that the fiscal and monetary house in order in time.
If we didn't get the fiscal and monetary house in order in time, what do you think would be the consequences on financial markets in respect of the relationship of, especially of China and the United States?
Well, the first question is, what's the consequence just in the United States of getting close to a point where there's no fiscal space? The U.S. hasn't been there before. And it could get very close to fiscal dominance within a frighteningly short period of time, especially given the health and the demographic pressures that are coming. So I don't think we need to worry about relations with China, because we'll have to worry about our own. It's it's either inflation or high real interest rates in that scenario, and probably both. And if you have both of those, that quite clearly is low growth, and that sets off even more problems in the fiscal dimension and so on. Whether it's that important with China, it's hard to say. The Chinese, as you know, have been making noises about wanting to get away from the dollar as their reserve currency. So in a sense, it would be reinforcing that sentiment on their part.
Okay, we'll talk about the Chinese proposal for an alternative global currency, but I wanted to ask you before about banking. Mm-hmm. One of the lessons we've learned from Japan, or this is a lesson certainly what we've observed in Japan, is that a recovery could not be engineered through fiscal and monetary policy alone. And there are some economists, I'm not speaking loud enough, but there are some economists who argue that it was the resolution of the banking crisis in the late 90s and the early part of this decade that allowed Japan to recover finally, and that the United States and Europe even to an even greater extent, is now repeating the same mistake by not forcefully making a resolution, ring fencing of bad assets, recapitalization of the system, if necessary through nationalization, and that would basically prolong the crisis. How do you see that?
Well, that's where I got to the bottom of the housing market being necessary, because until we get to the bottom of the housing market, no matter how much equity you pour into the banks, when more foreclosures come about, there's more loss of, more non-performing loans, and therefore more loss of equity, and you get right back into it. So that's why the housing market is so very important. I think there was and is, well, there was certainly, I don't know, the administration for the moment may have gone too far another direction, but there was certainly a strong case for creating a bad bank and putting the toxic assets in there instead of leaving them out as they have done. There certainly is a case for recapitalization, but as I said, at the same time as some of these other things are happening. And I think there was a case for shoring up the mortgage market earlier than they did, redoing bankruptcy laws on household bankruptcy, or housing bankruptcy, which is not quite the same thing, and a number of those things which could have sped up that part of the process and would have been important.
So what do you actually make of the Geithner plan? Is this going to work?
Well, I don't know what it is. I mean, it's really not clear. I mean, I'm not joking in this. I think they have been making policy as fast as they can, but it's simply not clear what they're going to do in some of these issues, and I don't think there's any way that anybody outside can judge it. I'm not even sure they agree on what they're going to do from one day to the next.
I mean, one element of the Geithner plan, as we know, is that they're not going to Congress to ask for new money. That they're trying to do this within the existing budget of TARP and the freedom of maneuver of the FDIC. The Germans have just launched a bank rescue plan, which is completely cost-free to the taxpayer. Can we basically solve this problem? I mean, assuming that the housing market behaves in a way in some reasonable way, that it will bottom out at some time, later this year, early next year. Is it reasonable to expect that we can get this for free, or is this going to cost us a lot of money?
Well, it's certainly going to cost, or it already has cost something, and it will cost more. So the real question is how much. I don't think that there's any way that this is going to be one that is cost-free.
Right. Let's talk about the international dimension of this crisis. Governor Zhu has, as you mentioned, made some noises. The noise he made was that he talked about the Chinese dollar trap, and he advocated the use of special drawing rights as an alternative global currency. You would be in a very good position to answer that question. So tell us, how unrealistic is this proposal?
Well, I mean, there are two parts to the answer. The first of which is that the SDR is composed of a bundle of currencies: the dollar, the pound, the euro, the yen, a few more. And if they want to create their bundles like that, there's nothing to stop them right now from doing it. They can go and they can, get that same bundle and use that currency bundle, and that's no problem at all. Now, SDRs as a legal entity are something else, because they're issued by the International Monetary Fund, and they are exchangeable only between governments. That is, if you somehow got a hold of an SDR, you would not be able to spend it. The only thing you could do is give it to your government, and your government could only give it to another government. So that's, I think, a very different issue, because what's going to be an international currency is something that has the faith and trust of the users of that currency, and it has to have convertibility above all else, and the SDR does not have that convertibility, period.
So, assuming we run with your scenario, a potential increase in inflation in America, a rise in real interest rates, possibly some tension in bond markets that could be expected in this scenario. China having invested over $1 trillion in various U.S. pieces of paper. The question is, will the dollar in such a scenario be unchallenged as the sort of the global reserve currency, or will there be others? I mean, the euro obviously being the second one at the moment, SDR or some other system. What is your feel for this?
Everybody thought that the dollar would depreciate as a result of the crisis, and as you know, it appreciated. At the moment, the world is still one where the dollar is the currency in which people have more faith than any other. There are some currencies that might be attractive to hold in small amounts, Australian dollar and so on, but I don't think you want to carry that too far. The euro has picked up as an international currency. I think the reserves are now 15% in euros, or such an amount, growing at maybe 1 or 1.5% a year. I think that'll keep on for a while, so the dollar will be less central.
But you don't see any sort of tectonic shifts in this relationship?
Well, the Chinese, you know, Keynes' old comment about if you owe your bank $1,000, you've got a problem. If it's $1 million, they've got a problem. Well, this is one of those. The Chinese have $1 trillion. And in that sense, they're not going to bring the house of cards down any more quickly than they have to, and they know exactly what the problem is. So I don't think that I see any massive pullout at all from them.
Let's talk about the future of international economic institutions in your role as, in a former role as a first deputy managing director of the IMF. You know, the IMF is really an institution that has a lot of things to do in times of crisis. Are you regretting now that you're not at the IMF at the moment?
No.
About the IMF, what do you think is the IMF? Will the IMF come out strengthened out of this crisis as an institution? Well,
there are two roles the IMF should be playing, or three, I suppose. One is the surveillance role in the normal sense, and it does that very well. It's got a core competence there. It's a pretty good firefighter, and when countries get into crisis, it's been reasonably good on that score. The third thing it should be doing is the global imbalances and all that, and that's where the key players are the United States, the Euro area, the UK, Japan, China, India, I suppose, maybe the oil exporters to Saudi Arabia. They are all very big players, and they are going to do what they want to do until such time as there's some kind of an international agreement, which I think is going to have to be rules-based, that somehow addresses some of these issues in a way that can be handled. I don't think it got very much attention in the press. I think the FT did pick it up, that Rodrigo Durato did try multilateral consultations and saw the need for it, and the fund was right on it. There was no problem there. Everybody met at the assistant deputy level, at the deputy level, at the ministerial level. Everybody agreed at all three levels that something needed to be done. Everybody agreed that what it was that the U.S. should cut its deficit, that the Chinese should cut their surplus, etc. And everybody went home and did nothing. End of story. And right now, the fund, obviously, like any fire department, when there are more fires, is busier. The surveillance role continues. They can make sensible statements, and if people want to listen, they can. But beyond that, in terms of the global balancing, I don't see how they can do it.
Right. So you're pessimistic on the question of global rebalancing. We've seen, you know, governments ignoring their advice. Is the fact that Europe is not fully represented, or is represented there by, you know, several players rather than a single player, also an impediment that one, you know, the world's second largest, or in fact, if you take the EU, the world's largest economy, is actually not pulling its weight?
Well, there's no question but that some of the emerging markets feel that they should have more say in the institution than they do, and that's probably right. In fact, almost all decisions at the fund are made on the basis of consensus, and I think it makes less difference than they think it does. I think they need to have more voice, and I was very encouraged to see Governor Zhu's proposal, simply because it's the first time the Chinese have really participated in the international debate at all actively, and that's a positive. Even if I don't think the SDRs will fly, I think it's still a step in the right direction. But I do not see really at the moment how we're going to get there. As you say, Europe is overrepresented by lots. The U.S., according to the traditional formula, is slightly underrepresented because the U.S. actually did give up some votes to do something, which was, I suppose, almost token in the smallness of it, but it was in the right direction. Something is probably going to have to give in that regard, but I think it's going to be up to the Europeans to decide that if they are a union, they ought to act like one.
If we look long term on this question, what would you, if you were given the task to resolve the question of global imbalances, you know, for good, and you were sort of the dictator at the IMF, and you could basically implement the policy? Totally unrealistic assumptions, of course, but what actions would you recommend in terms of currencies? Would you recommend a system? Some people are saying we need to go back to a system of complete free-floating. Others say we need a system going back to a Bretton Woods type arrangement. The problem, some say, is the fact that half of the world is tied to the dollar, the other half is free-floating. Is this an issue at all, or should this be an issue?
Well, you can't look at an exchange rate alone. You can't look at macro alone or fiscal alone. You can't look at monetary. That's how the three go together, which is why I'm not at all sure you can approach it that way. My guess is that, and this is really, if I said we don't know about other things, we really don't know about this. We're going to have a rules-based system, and it's going to have to be some kind of formula, if you like, that people get together and agree on outcomes so that China, for example, will stay within a range of, I don't know, current account surplus of 2 to 5% of GDP. The U.S. will make sure its deficit doesn't get out of the range of whatever, et cetera, et cetera. And you're going to need a rules-based system, much like we do in trade, much like we do in other things. And there would have to be penalty functions and a legalistic procedure to deal with those who do not behave according to it, which would have to take into account things like lags and so on. So what I've sketched is the barrister sketches, and it would have to be fleshed out. But as in my thinking, it's the only way that we can do it.
And it will have to involve the central banks as well in terms of their monetary policy.
Well, if you look at the outcome, i.e. the current account deficit, how you get that within that range is up to each individual country. I mean, that's why I think you can't do it on the other, is because you can't do it on monetary, you can't do it on fiscal, and you can't do it on exchange rate, because it is the conjunction of the three and how consistent they are with each other. But you can observe a current account deficit. It's an observable outcome, and you know what goes into it, and countries would then have a choice. Right now we have Latvia, having decided that they will maintain their exchange rate, taking a 25% nominal cut in wages in the public sector because they're choosing to do it by domestic deflation. I'm not sure that they should have made that choice, but it's certainly a choice that a country has the right to make. And doing it on the basis of what you need to achieve rather than on how you achieve it seems to me would be more likely to get somewhere in the process.
Right. On your assessment of what is likely to happen in the future, do you think we will get some new, of the process that you described, some new Bretton Woods type global agreement on balances, or will it take another crisis until we actually get to that point?
Thinking among the economists I know is swinging more and more toward the underlying global imbalance problem as sort of being the underlying thing leading to the low real interest rates and so on down the line. That's come up strongly only in the past year. And I think as that goes on, there may, or I hope, there could be some move in that direction in the near term. But truthfully, I don't see governments or the thinking as yet far enough advanced to get us there. I fear that what will happen is we will get out of this crisis however we get out of it, for better or for worse. And for 10 or 15 years, things will go along, and then pretty soon we'll be back moving in the same direction again, unless we do something now. But if people aren't convinced enough, and if there's not the political will, it won't happen.
I mean, the focus on policymakers at the moment is on regulation. It is on immediate firefighting, as we've seen with the decision by the G20 summit to award funds to the IMF for crisis management, to increase the SDR budget. Do you believe that these measures taken by the G20 will at least solve the problem, insufficient as they are? We agree to sort out the problem in the long run. Are we basically out of the worst part of the crisis in terms of potential currency attacks in East Europe, other emerging markets coming under pressure?
That was 10 questions.
Please answer.
Okay. Well, first off, I'm not as sanguine about the G20 as you are. You may recall their first heads of government meeting was last November. They had no other positive action they could take. They couldn't think of anything else to do, so they all swore that they would have a standstill on any trade protection for the next year. Nobody of those G20, and there are really 22 of them, was going to do any protectionist measure. The World Bank did a report in March. 17 of them had already undertaken new protectionist measures, and these were not always trivial things. Argentina going to much more strenuous import licensing. India cut off Chinese imports of a number of goods. I will not even mention the United States and the automobile industry, Buy American, and a number of other things. But I mean, lots of countries have been guilty. Now, if this is G20 commitment, I'm supposed to depend on it?
Right, so you're not dependent on it then.
Then what they committed to, come April, was a series of things which we'll see whether they do or not. They haven't as yet done most of them, and some of them didn't cost them anything. I'm sure those will get done. The Sdr allocation will be there, and the SDRs, $250 billion that they're talking about allocating. My back of the envelope number says that arguably $50 billion will go to countries low enough in income and in need enough so they'll actually spend it. So that's a $50 billion benefit for low-income countries, which is not a bad thing, but it doesn't really address the magnitude of the crisis. I think the U.S. Congress was going to vote early this week on a defense appropriation. I don't know what happened on that because the amendment that would have given the funds, the additional funds you talk about, was in that bill. And it was quite contentious just as I left the state, so I don't know what's happening there. Regulation is an interesting one. Everybody agrees. Does anybody in this room think we need regulation that is not sensible? And what they want in the communications, they want sensible regulation. I mean, how can you disagree with that? Now, what that is may be in the eye of the beholder. And I think the ideas as to what it is are very different between different people in different countries. And again, there's a lot of discussion going on. This whole big bank issue is a huge one. If you keep big banks that are too big to fail, the argument is they need tighter regulation. And I think I've got quite a bit of sympathy with that argument. But that's one way of going. Higher equity requirements, counter-cyclical equity requirements, subordinated debt, or alternatively preferred stock. The banks have to convert if their equity falls. There are a number of these things, all of which could make sense, but how we get there, I don't know. Internationally, I'm even more skeptical. The efforts in international regulation so far have consisted largely of Basel I and Basel II. Basel I was the one that said that short-term borrowing was not to count very much against risk. So then when developing countries borrow short because they can't borrow long, that's risk-free to the banks. That doesn't make any sense, and that helped in the 1980s get us where we were and so on and so forth. So now this time we're going on risk-weighted capital in another sense that doesn't make any sense either. And if that's what international regulation is going to do, I don't think it's very sensible. So I would be against that.
So you also implicitly doubt that we will be able to agree on or impose hefty regulation on the financial sector, except for some national measures, some revenge measures on pay, but nothing of great substance, no fundamentally different regulation on credit derivatives, for example, forcing them onto stock exchanges,
Well,
regulated exchanges.
Making markets would make sense. Checking bank pay is one of the ones that I regard as unsensible regulation. The best you can do is you can either drive good bankers to other countries that aren't so stupid, or if you don't do that, then you'll drive them out of banking, if all the countries do it together, out of banking into other, and here we want a better banking system, so we're going to drive the best people away, which doesn't seem to me to do it. So that's not what I would have regarded as part of the sensible part. Some of these other things I think can be individually done in countries, but there are needs for cross-border things. I mean, Europe knows that better than anybody else with the Irish Guarantee Deposit Scheme, which took everybody else right away, and there are measures like that that require it. But how you get there is something else. And the U.S. administration has stated, although they've stated other things and then backed down, that they will not go for international regulation. They did not give a reason.
So you basically predict that the future of finance will be pretty much the same as the past of finance, except a little bit more dysfunctional.
Well, I'm not sure about more dysfunctional. I mean, I can well imagine that getting variable and countercyclical equity requirements would make a lot of sense. I can see getting rid of some of the bigger banks would make a lot of sense. Getting a market in some of these, I don't think you could regulate all financial instruments, because if I lend you $1, am I a financial institution? It just can't be done. Money is fungible. But you can have markets in mortgages and things like that, so that when they're split up, people can tell what they are, and you can have much more transparency, and that would help.
Right. You mentioned briefly, and let's change subject, let's focus on trade. You mentioned that countries have imposed trade restrictions. Is trade are we going to see, in your expectation, going to see more of it, or is this not as bad as we expected? And some people say, okay, it's gotten a little worse. We've seen some measures, but really we haven't seen anything like we saw in the 1930s. That isn't really as bad, and let's not worry too much about trade.
So as long as it's not as bad as the 1930s, it's okay?
It's what people say. So what do you say?
First off, I think it depends a bit on how long the whole situation lasts. But what has come up is a lot of new forms of protectionism. The auto industry is a classic case in point, of course, where the United States decided that it would bail out its companies, and of course then we had the Canadians immediately doing so, the Koreans immediately doing so, the French, the Brits, and so on and so forth. So everybody's lending, and the world, we taxpayers in the world as a whole are paying an awful lot more than we need to for the auto industry, which does need restructuring, but not of the kind we're doing. And other industries, I fear we may see some of that same kind of thing. The Buy American provisions are still there. Some of them are actually quite shocking. And other countries are no better in that regard. If we get the turnaround, as I hope this summer, I would hope we could get back from that somehow, although if the G20 wanted to do something more useful, they'd get the Doha round completed very quickly. And they would, excuse me, bring bound tariffs and applied tariffs closer together and otherwise shore up the system. So there's plenty to be done on trade. The evidence seems to be that trade credit froze more quickly than any other kind last fall and is actually increasing again now. So that's one form of credit that's flowing more, and there are some positive results from that. And the trade numbers for this year may not be quite as bad as the WTO is forecasting, but that doesn't make them good.
Okay, I would like to open the discussion to the audience. We've gone through really a lot of material here, and also give us the opportunity to drink a glass of water. Any question from the audience to Anne KRUEGER?
Or to him?
Not to me. Over there and then over there. Do we have a microphone, or how does it work? Sorry, we'll get a microphone in a second. There comes the microphone.
Just a minute, I'm getting nothing but the static that George did at the moment.
No. Okay, thanks.
Nope, this is not working.
Just
static. All you hit is the same thing George had this afternoon.
I can stand up, so can I? So you can see me. Okay. The question is about unbalances. In particular, as far as I know, 3/4 of American growth in the last many years has been due to consumer spending. So, and this consumer spending was financed by mortgage, home withdrawal, or some other kind of debt. So, the problem is that if there is no other source of spending power for consumers, there will be not any sizable recovery. The question is, don't you think that there should be some kind of increasing of consumer powers, increasing of consumer spending power in the future in order to be able to have a more sustainable and better growth?
Well, consumer spending clearly went up and consumer saving clearly went down. As I said, it got down to -4% of disposable income, but it's now back up to +4. It has changed quite quickly and quite markedly. So there's that. But the second thing is, the part of the reason that happened was because of these global imbalances, and that was part of the U.S. current account deficit. And one of the things that needs to happen if the U.S. is going to cut its current account deficit is that we need more exports relative to imports, and that will be something of an offset to a somewhat dampened consumer spending. So no, I don't think at the moment that we need to do more on that one. We do, though, obviously need to get out of the recession and get back to a higher level of real income, and that in itself would, of course, give consumers more spending power.
Okay, question over there.
Sarah Iezzoni, Bari. I would know if the government that didn't use the Keynesian politics used the economic politic more libertarian. Posso parlare italiano? Ah, grazie,
I
grazie.
think this works here. You should be, no, this should be.
Okay.
1, 2, 3, testing. Well, good evening. What could have happened if governments, instead of applying Keynesian policies, can you hear me? 1, 2, 3.
This has got static. Go ahead.
Volevo sapere se il...
My question. the US government and the other governments in Europe, with the exception of Italy, did not provide cash to the banks. So the question, if the US government had not used huge funds to support demand by financing banks who might have been guilty of using the subprime in a wrong way, if they had supported the economy by using the same funds, but giving the funds or using funds to stimulate consumption, to support households or to support small enterprises, what would have happened? Do you think that maybe a multiplier effect could have happened, or what could have happened? Maybe that could have hampered recovery if such a huge amount of money could have been given to households. And the second wave of the crisis, with the issue of credit debit cards, is that second leg of the crisis coming? Is it true or not? Did American banks release too many debit cards or not?
And to do with, wouldn't the U.S. have been better off to spend more, give consumers more spending power instead of putting to the banks? I think I don't think one can look at it quite that way. The financial system is the lifeblood of an economy. No modern economy can function without a good, well-working financial system. In fact, the economic history of the West is an economic history where you had real advances, but they always took the financial system going along to support that. And the history of the Great Depression, in fact, the conclusion as to why the Great Depression was as bad as it was because the policy mistake was not to maintain the flow of credit. They let it collapse when they shouldn't have. So I think the government of the United States, and probably others, has a very hard time explaining why they should do something with the banks and not for those, quote, poor auto workers. But on the other hand, an economy can thrive without autos being produced, and it cannot thrive without the financial system. So that just had to be part of the solution. So that was your first question. Your second question was on credit cards and how was that going? The delinquency rate on credit cards is up, but not astonishingly so, yes. If, in fact, the turning point comes sometime this summer, there's reason to think that that may not happen, but it's a worry, there's no doubt.
Okay. There was a question over there.
Sì, mi chiamo Giovanni Caudo, sono un docente della Facoltà di Architettura di Roma 3.
A professor of architecture. I'd like to congratulate you for the importance of the housing market. You stressed, indeed, that's a key element. You said that this is one of the key factors, the real estate is one of the key factors for the crisis. But you also said that there are opportunities to come out from the crisis because of the real estate market. I'm a bit concerned, and I'm concerned because a survey conducted by The Economist a few years ago estimated that between 1998 and 2006, the household real estate moved from 30 to 70 trillion dollars in less than 8 years. It is as if the GDP of those countries had doubled. That means that we took a lot of resources from households. And so I'm a bit worried if the crisis is going to be solved by stimulating the wish to buy houses from families. But I had expected that one could come out from the crisis with a slightly different economy from that of the past. As a matter of fact, this is not the case. So, why can't we speak of producing wealth through the production system of Western countries? So have we given up to spend for research and development? Thank you.
So far, there has been no support for construction. The support has been to help families stay in their homes and other things that would make, whenever there are foreclosures, what that means is the banks are going to resell the houses. That means more supply on the market. That means more downward pressure on the prices. It makes sense for the government to try and help people who can refinance their homes in a way where they can pay their mortgages over a longer period of time or something to do one. And that's good because they can stay in their houses. It's good because then there's less overhang in the market. It's good because the turning point will come sooner. That does not mean there's more construction of housing at the moment. It does, of course, mean the turning point will come sooner, but that's, I think, a different issue. So I don't think there's been that. Now, the increase that you cited in The Economist is the increase in the value of the housing, not the value of new construction over that period. And there's a big difference because part of the reason we got in trouble was because the prices went up so much, and the concern was that the relative price of housing had increased. So I think that much as I share your issue, that the policy has not been quite as foolish as you think it's been in that regard.
The lady over there, please.
Grazie. Come semplici cittadini, ma anche amministratori.
But also as local administrators, we have appreciated what you said about large financial and banking institutions, what you said about G20 and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. You also stated that some measures have been stated or declared, but then they have not been turned into reality by individual governments. What is the case, it would have been possible to reduce the crisis. So my question to you is the following. Which measures discussed during the latest G20 meetings could have partly prevented the crisis from being generalized? And then, what do you think of some economists who support the reintroduction of protectionism to avoid the American economic defeat?
On the G20, obviously, well, they said they wanted to do sensible regulation, but they can't agree on what that is, so that's why they're not doing anything. I tried to say that I think there are things individual governments can do along the regulatory side that would make things better in individual countries. I hope that there will be a way forward on some of the things that could be done internationally, but I don't see action coming there right now. On protectionism, I think it's crucial that we not go into a protectionist spiral now. The worst, I mean, the United States, like it or don't like it, is too large to leave out of the world trading system. And unfortunately, if other countries start taking protectionist measures against the United States citizens will put pressure on their congressmen, even more than they do now, and they do it now, for more protection. And I would be very much afraid then of a trade war. And with a trade war, I would be afraid of this sinking back into a 1930s style beggar thy neighbor situation. So I think that's horribly dangerous. It's bad enough you hurt yourself when you protect, but in this kind of environment, the retaliation possibilities are truly frightening and not something that anybody should wish on this poor world. We have enough problems without having, it's much easier to impose protection than it is to get rid of. It just is not symmetric in that regard at all.
Okay, we now have, I'm going to take 3 questions in a row, and then because we only have 15 minutes left, we won't be able to get everyone in, but we started with this gentleman over there, and there was this gentleman over there, and the gentleman at the back in the blue shirt. These are the 3 questions.
Excuse me, I was having the microphone. I just wanted to ask.
No, I'm sorry. I'm deciding who's taking the questions. I'm sorry. You're not. I'll be starting with the gentleman over there. Me? Yes.
Okay.
I have just three little questions. Do you think that this position taken by the U.S. establishment in the China proposals is risky, or could have some diplomatical problems in the next or some future? And then, if in the deflation-inflation cycle there is some generational component, and if, like in the 30s, it could be at a time for new theoretical proposals in economics.
Okay, the gentleman over there, who's just raising his hand over there. Could you pass on the microphone to the gentleman? No, excuse me. Over there.
Hello. Thank you very much for your remarks. I, like you, am also a former staff member at the IMF. I was there earlier and at a much, much lower level than you were. My question has to do with your point about a rules-based system. And I'm interested specifically in what, if anything, you think that the Obama administration might be able to do to encourage putting in place a rules-based system of the sort that you mentioned. Thanks.
Okay. And the gentleman who's raising his hand over there with the white paper.
Thanks. My name is Francisco Anese, and I guess I still consider myself a student from the University of Cambridge. I would have two main questions. The first is actually it follows your concept of global imbalances, in the sense that yesterday Domenico Siniscalco, a former finance minister and a professor, stressed the fact that we were living in a world of imbalances, but we are now moving towards a more balanced world, at least in four aspects. The first is we are moving into a world where the US is consuming less, and you do have China that is saving a bit less. You do have a world in which politics still counts. So you do have Washington counting a bit more than the New York Stock Exchange. The relationship between, or the discrepancy between the real economy and the financial markets is going to be rebalanced. And the degree of inequalities that we used to have in the 90s, so the fat cats of Wall Street versus the normal people, are going to be addressed. So he was saying we are moving now towards a world of, towards a more balanced world, and I wonder how you would react to those, to that point. I mean, he's also a banker because he's a vice chairman of Morgan Stanley, and he needs to be an optimist. But the second quick question would be simply, I mean, you lived in the best of the two worlds of Washington, D.C., both the World Bank and the IMF. And can you give us some the practical dimension of the reforms that will come out of the crisis for these two institutions? Some of the tendencies were already present, the fact that we now have the last head of the IMF who's an European, but I guess that there are a lot of questions, I mean, relating to reforms and international financial architecture. Thanks.
Yep. Okay. What do I think of the U.S. government and its policy right now with regard to situation in China proposals? I do not think the current administration has communicated what its policies will be. I think Secretary of the Treasury Geithner was arriving in China today. We'll know a lot more about that at the end of this week. He made some unfortunate statements during his confirmation hearing to the effect that the Chinese were manipulating the currency. That cannot have helped anything. Since that time, he's made several obvious efforts to back away from that statement, which I do not think will hurt a thing. I'm sure he's going to try and convince them, as I believe they should be convinced, that it's in their own self-interest to increase domestic consumption relative to GDP, et cetera, but how far he'll get is another question. But I don't think we know how the Obama administration will deal with that issue yet. Let's see, the second question was Would we get new policy proposals as we did in the 1930s with regard to inflation, et cetera? I do think that a lot of academic work is going to come out of this and from the policy community too. I don't think we're yet at the point where we'll see a lot of, quote, brand new thinking because we're not quite there. But I think already we've seen quite a bit in terms of incentives for bankers. We've seen quite a bit in terms of bank structures and how you might modify them. And I think more along those lines is coming quite quickly. So certainly there's that. And of course, we can always hope that there'll be more. It seems to me that the dichotomy between people who consider themselves financial economists and those who consider themselves real economists has been far too great. And if anybody didn't think finance was part of macro, this crisis should convince them to the contrary. So something will be happening there almost for sure. Okay, what do I think are the prospects for the rules-based system? Well, as I said, I'm not at all optimistic, but I think like anything else, if today one of you could go and persuade your prime minister that this was the greatest thing under the sun, it would still get nowhere. It would get nowhere because, first off, there needs to be a lot of discussion. There needs to be a lot of thought about it. There need to be a lot of people thinking about how you might do this. Getting some rules that might make sense would be relatively hard work. It would not be easy. And the kinds of changes that have come about in the world economy have not been because somebody had a great idea one day and sold their prime minister on it the next. It normally takes quite a bit of filtering of ideas through the system before they get there, and that has not even started in this particular case. I think that's something where we do need to do a great deal of work and where the academics among you and the policy wonks among you can can contribute usefully. Okay. We're rebalancing in such a way that between the real economy and the financial markets, maybe, I don't know. I don't know how you would measure how much power the financial markets had ahead of time or afterward, nor do I know, how you'd ever measure this balance. Certainly it was true in the 1930s that the bankers and the financial people were somewhat discredited and their voice went down. That may happen again, I don't know. And if it does happen again, I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think on some of these regulation issues, we very much need the inputs of the financial community, and if people go ahead in a vindictive style because they think those bankers were so bad, I'm sure that will get us nowhere. So I hope that whatever rebalancing there is will be constructive and not otherwise. The next one you had, I'm having trouble reading my writing here. The increasing inequality, I don't have any comment on. Then finally, the World Bank and the IMF reforms. I don't think we see very much yet. Will there be no nationality requirement for a new managing director or a new president of the World Bank? I suspect there will not be. What worries me is, and that goes to the identity subject of this conference, that what worries me is I read that some African has, after a conference where they've talked about getting rid of the nationality crisis, now we can have an African as president, and someone says now we can have an Asian, it's their turn. And the nationality issue, as it has come up in the United Nations, strikes me as one of the major, if not the major reason why that organization has not been effective. You cannot have people working side by side where the accident of birth is going to determine who gets promoted. The bank and the fund have been far more, not completely, but far more meritocratic than the other institutions, which is one of the reasons they've been able to do something, and I would hate to see that destroyed. So going to a system where you choose the best qualified guy, I am all for. Going to a system where we don't have a nationality issue, so this time it's the turn of East Asia, next time it's the turn of Africa, then we'll go to Latin America, then the Middle East, that really would be, I think, very unhealthy. That one, I'm schizophrenic because I like the idea of getting away from nationalities, but I'm not sure it does it. And I think you'd have to, or I would like to see some really ironclad understanding to get away from the nationality issue if you went that far. On other reforms, it's hard to say. I don't think enough has happened yet. The fund is very busy with what it's doing. Its financing base should be reformed, and I think will be reformed, and that was coming anyway, but this will speed it up, and that's a good thing. On other issues, I'm just not sure. So I don't think I can say anything more. Thank you.
And thank you very much. Well, I thank you, Anne, for this marathon of Q&A, and I thank the audience. And sorry I couldn't take everybody to ask the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.